Yes guys, we are of course back with another video. Now then, as I mentioned in my last video, I wanted to sort of stray away from mixtapes and all that kind of stuff. So over Christmas I went looking for some shockumentaries, and I ended up stumbling against one which really caught my eye, so I decided to give it a watch. And today I'm going to be reviewing that for you. Now when I say I'm going to review it, I don't mean I'm going to go through every single clip within this shockumentary. I'm just going to give you guys a brief explanation as to what it was about and some parts that really stood out for me. So it's not going to be like any mixtape explanations that I've done or upcoming mixtape explanations, if you know what I mean. So the shockumentary that I stumbled upon was called Faces of Gore, directed by Todd Tiersland, who was also responsible for partially directing Necrophiles 2. So this was a name that I'd never heard before, but I quite enjoyed what he had to offer with this one. Throughout this whole thing, you're basically taken through 3 different subcategories. These are crashes, suicides, and murders. So you were basically taken through each section by a man named Vincent van Gogh, who weirdly enough has the same name as some guy from Luigi's Mansion, if I'm not wrong. And he mentions right at the start that all of these clips were actually filmed in Japan. So within each clip you didn't really understand what was going on, but luckily there was a narrative and a story to help you through. Now I'm obviously not going to go into every single story. So first things first, we'll talk about the content. What did it include? So as I've just mentioned, the categories were split into 3 different sections: crashes, suicides, and murders. Now the first thing worth noting, is that it didn't actually show the initial crash, suicide or murder. It was basically the aftermath of these things that had happened. So for example, in the final section, which was murders, there was nobody stabbing each other or hurting or torturing each other. It was purely just what I'd call crime scene footage.
Greetings, I am Dr. Vincent van Gore, a member of the American Institute of Goreology and a leading expert on the phenomena of death. Like yourself, I too have a keen fascination with the many faces of gore. That is why my work at the Institute is so important. I have been in Japan conducting research into the realm of the dead now for the past few years, and I am finally ready to share the results of my experiments with the general public. Everything I have discovered about death, I have here in these files. This first file is the one I like to call Crash.
So we'll start off with crashes, which was the first subsection of this whole movie, let's call it. The crashes focused on motorcycles, cars and one train, in which we were given a slight story to what had happened and also some pretty gruesome crime scene video. And to bundle all the clips together into one little explanation, the majority of these clips were basically people's heads who had been just completely obliterated by the accident that had happened to them. There were also a couple of videos of people who had been burnt badly within these videos, especially from the train, and there was a car accident where people had been charred to a crisp. And like I said again, there was a big story behind some of these clips. For example, 2 lovers were on their way back home when they crashed and both of them died. And another clip included a man who had gotten into a fatal car crash on the way home to see his wife and child, in which it was also his child's 7th birthday, which I did find quite sad. And that was basically it for the car crash stuff. It was all the same sort of stuff with a little backstory as to who the person may have been and what their story was.
So why do you think it is so many people are willing to throw their lives away? Tell me, Are you in a hurry to become another one of my faces of gore? No? Well then, my next file will surely convince you of the rightness of your thinking. I like to call it suicide.
The second subsection was, of course, suicides. Now this is a pretty sensitive subject, so I'm not going to go too much into the smaller details of these clips. However, the majority of these clips were basically hangings or people burnt alive or people who had shot themselves as a way out. And there was definitely one clip in there that actually stood out for me, which I found quite unusual in the most respectable way, in which a lady had hung herself with an electric wire, and she'd been hanging there for several days, in which her neck had slowly got longer and longer, and it was sad to see, very unusual, obviously in the most respectful way. And there was also a clip there which featured a young Japanese man who had apparently committed suicide because he didn't get the grade he wanted at school, and he was so scared of facing his own parents that he unfortunately took that way out. And that's really everything for the suicide clips, all bundled into one. A lot of hangings, a couple of burnings, and somebody who had shot themselves.
Well, enough reminiscing, right? The next soul-sickening stop on the tour of human tragedy is contained in this file. In the course of this film, I have shown you the many faces of gore resulting from traffic accidents and suicides. Now, I will show you perhaps the most terrible face of all: murder.
And then the last subsection was, of course, murders. Now, as I mentioned towards the start of this video, a lot of the murders that featured within these clips weren't of people who were currently getting murdered. It was all crime scene footage of people who had been murdered, basically. So, you know, there were no beatings, no stabbings, no shootings, nothing of the sort, nothing that you'd see in just a random mixtape. It was just a crime scene with a backstory. And one of these that actually stood out to me was to do with a mass shooting of who I believe were prostitutes, and it was all gang related, and I've completely forgotten the guy's name, but his body was found after this mass shooting. 3 days later, he was responsible for the shooting, and his body was found 3 days later with a bullet in the side of his temple, in his head. And given that handguns are or were illegal, let me just mention that, I should have mentioned this at the start, this whole thing was made in 1999, so at the time handguns were illegal in Japan, so it was strange to see these kinds of stories come out into the open. And I mean, it'd be the same in the UK today. Handguns and guns of that nature are completely legal, so hearing about a shooting, let alone a mass shooting, is incredibly rare and never happens. And again, as with the first two subsections, you can roll all of these clips into one, as it was all just the same sort of stuff. Again, crime scene stuff, basically. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is a bit of controversy within this whole shockumentary, and that was some of the pretty risky jokes that were made. Now, given that this is 1999, over 20 years ago, people probably didn't get as offended as they do by jokes these days. So a lot of these jokes were probably just brushed off as a bit of a gag, basically. And it seems that throughout the years, people have become more and more offended by things, and I'll give you some examples of some of the jokes. Some are bad, some are a bit distasteful, and Some were okay. When I say okay, they weren't incredibly horrific. So one of the not so offensive jokes, shall we say, was actually included in the first clip of Crashes. Now this included two men who were playing chicken on a motorbike, or two motorbikes even, and they both ended up crashing and dying. Now one of the men actually had his head somewhat wrapped around a street lamp or a metal post. They basically dragged him out of the metal post, and the man narrating said something along the lines of, "This man now looks like Humpty Dumpty, except all the king's horses and all the king's men could never put him back together again." So that was one of the distasteful but not one of the most horrific jokes within this whole thing. So we're going to move on to one of the distasteful jokes within this tape. Do you remember earlier when I mentioned that there was a man who was going home to see his wife and his 7-year-old child? There was actually a joke made in this one where the narrator said that instead of the little girl opening her father's gift for her birthday this year, she will in fact be opening her dad's body bag. So now I'm going to move on to the worst joke that was in this shockumentary, and I must warn you, it was quite bad. So this is referring back to the clip with the couple who were driving home and got into an unfortunate car accident. And this joke basically involved the woman of the accident. So for this joke, the narrator basically said that a man named Mr. Sato was going to use this woman's body for his necrophiliac fetishes. And this was one of those jokes that, it's a rare occurrence that this happens, but this was one of those jokes that made me facepalm a little bit and cringe quite badly. And what happened in this clip was when they pulled this woman out of the car, it was discovered that she had blood running down her legs, which is something known as hematoma something or other. I'll try and find out the name of it and put it somewhere. But then the narrator said that this would mean that her body would be unusable for Mr. Sato's experiments, shall we call them. Now the crash part is basically where all these really bad jokes happened. There wasn't any in the suicide section, which is great because it means I don't have to talk about that. And there wasn't any in the murders section either. So essentially what all these clips were was a commentary mixed with jokes with some ambient background horror music, and that was basically it for the whole hour 20 of this shockumentary. Now the third thing that I picked up on was the sound effects that were used within this shockumentary. They tended to, instead of using the background noise from the clips, they seem to have added in some sort of splattering sound effects. For example, when somebody one of the ambulance crew put a guy's brain on top of his dead body, they used a splattering sound, a very stock sounding splattering sound. And this was usually the case when it showed the crime scene investigators and whatnot, paramedics, whatever, basically clearing up the scene, picking up the bodies, picking up the body parts. It tended to use these squidgy sounds. The fourth thing that I want to mention is just one particular clip in this video, which was probably meant to be a bit of a joke as well. Within the murders section they had an interview with who was apparently a hired killer. Now I'm not Japanese, nor do I know the language, but I do know that what the killer was saying, or the apparent killer was saying, was completely different to what had been put on the screen that was used as subtitles. For example, towards the end of the interview, there was a dog barking outside which could be heard clearly from the clip. The interviewer asked a very short question, in which the killer gave a very short answer back. However, in the subtitles, it said, "Oh, that damn dog, I'm going to go and use it for target practice." And like I said, I don't know Japanese, but I know full well that that sentence did not relate to the subtitles that came up. I can probably show a screenshot or even the video, I guess, of this interview. You can see it, I'm sure you can see it, so enjoy this interview, I guess.
This contract killer agreed to be interviewed so long as we disguised his true identity and did not ask any questions pertaining to the murder of Tiger Joe Wang. Let us hear what this professional has to say about the business of death.
มีครอบครัวหรือยังคะ
妻と2人の娘がいます。
ลูกสาวอายุเท่าไหร่
娘さんは
16と14になりました。
ไม่รู้บอกแต่ว่า
ガードマンをしていると言っています。だいたい10年。
ค่าหนึ่งคนได้
報酬
รับ
は
ค่าย จ้าง
く
ประมา
ら
ณเท่าไหร่
แล้วแต่
日本円で1人20万円ぐらいです。
พวกเอเจนต์เฮโรอีนเจ้าของบริษัท
半分が麻薬組織、
คนใน
あとは企業
ครอบ
と
ครัวเดียวกัน
身内殺しです。
ก็ไป
あえて
วัด
何も
ทำบุญบ้าง
祈るだけです。
เงินที่ได้
身
มา
を
ใช้
隠
จ่าย
す
มัน
方法は
ใช้
普通にしていればいいんですよ。
And that's all I've really got to say in regards to this shockumentary. Like I said, I didn't want to go into full detail on every single clip, as each section was basically the same thing. There were just some key parts that I wanted to talk about, which I found quite interesting, that I'd never really seen in a shockumentary before. And let's keep in mind that this is like my second proper review that I've done on this channel. I did one way back on Cannibal Holocaust, and that was quite easy to talk about, as you could talk about the plot. However, with this thing there was no plot, so I basically had to go through the parts that I thought were quite interesting, I suppose you could say, or parts that quite stood out to me, and parts that I just found a bit gruesome or unpolitically correct, I suppose the word is. But despite all the cringy jokes, I do believe that this one's worth a watch especially if you're interested in sort of what happens at crime scenes and all that kind of stuff. How do they clean the bodies up? And let me just say that it's all focused obviously in Japan, so it's just the Japanese way of doing things. For example, in pretty much every single clip, they put the body onto what looked like a giant paper towel, and then just put what looked like massive paper towels onto the person, you know, instead of just covering them, he, her, it, with just one big cover. They basically covered the body with what looked like paper towels. Probably wasn't paper towels, but it looked like them. And if there's another thing that I noticed about these clips, it was that none of these scenes were actually sort of cordoned off like they definitely would be here. You'd cordon a certain perimeter off so that the scene couldn't be accessed, and you do that pretty much straight away. However, in these clips, that wasn't the case. Overall, it's definitely worth a watch, and I would recommend it. I do think Vincent van Gogh is a great host, and I know for sure that I'll be covering Faces of Gore 2 at some point. At the moment, it would just be a way of finding what the best way to review this sort of stuff is, without going into every single detail on a clip, but also giving you guys a bit of an image of what happened within the tape. And yeah, that's everything I've really got to say about this shockumentary, and if you've managed to make it this far, thank you guys for watching, and if you want, like, subscribe, and maybe click that little bell next to the subscribe button. Go watch Faces of Gore, it's not bad. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next video.